Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Safety Brief. Today, we're diving into a hot topic in cybersecurity, one that's been around for decades but remains just as essential today, and that is firewalls. Think of them as the digital moat protecting your businesses from cyber threats. We know in 2025, with all the advancements in cybersecurity, the question is, are they still as crucial as they once were? The short answer to that is absolutely, and we're going to break that down today. All right, so before we get too deep into this topic, let's start with the basics. Can you break down what exactly a firewall is and why it's considered the first line of defense in cybersecurity?
Yeah, Elizabeth, most definitely. And it's a good topic to discuss because, like you had mentioned, there's a lot of different marketing campaigns and a lot of different, um, how do you say, cutting edge technologies, mentioning or making mention of the firewall being a deprecated control or just legacy technology. And we need to provide context and put some meat on that bone, if you will, and flesh that out further because that could be misleading. And I understand where those platforms and marketing efforts are coming from, but we also want to make sure that we're not coming up with something new just for the sake of something new and it becomes snake oil, right? It's not legitimate value. And so effectively, the word firewall gets tossed around a lot with router. This isn't intended to be a CCNA or a PCNSA type brief, but functionally, in order for you to be secured on the internet, meaning leaving whatever network you're on, either at work or at home, all traffic on the internet, once you leave your house, is public. It's public traffic. It's unencrypted. It's plain text. It's out there for people to see. Back when the internet was created, it was not created to be safe. It was created for you and your buddies to connect across geographic, state lines, global lines, etc. And so it was not built with security in mind. And so what a firewall does is it functionally has filters in place and monitor functions in place to look at whether it's behavior, whether it's certain networks that should or should not be accessing certain networks. There's geographic controls, as well as content related controls on some firewalls, basically saying, hey, we want to allow certain types of traffic, but we want to deny or block other types of traffic, right? And that could be category driven, that could be specific website or specific service driven, So, but again, it is a filter that is not already existing on your normal internet service provider device. We need to be really, really clear here again about the difference between a router and a firewall. So a router is functionally taking you from your little home network and carrying you, almost making a bridge from your little private network at home out into the World Wide Web, right? The big ocean. And so there are very little, if any, security controls on a typical ISP provided firewall. Marketing will say different, promos will say different, your friends or your colleagues or your install individual coming from your ISP company will tell you different. But again, that's why words matter. It's why definitions matter. And so, again, that's the basic function of a firewall, right? Is to basically look at internet traffic, look at a variety of different variables, right? Every firewall is a little different. Certainly, there are common denominator controls, but yeah, it's keeping you safe going from your private little network, either at your home or at your business, out to the internet, which is unencrypted, plain text, not secure by nature.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mike. I like to think of it as a bodyguard almost. so
Right.
Now, we've been talking about firewalls for years in the space. Some people might argue that with AI threat detection, zero trust models, and endpoint security, firewalls are outdated. So let's break down why they're still essential in 2025. I can start this one off by saying while security has evolved, so have cyber threats. Attackers are constantly finding new ways to breach networks, and a firewall is still one of the most effective ways to filter out malicious traffic before it can do any damage. It's not just about blocking threats, it's about visibility, control, and enforcing security policies across an organization. How about you, Mike? Do you have anything further on that one?
Yeah, again, I think it's important to stop and define terms like we're doing, and it's not meant to be semantically difficult, but it really is difficult in a world where a lot of people could be saying the same thing but meaning different things. And that's why, for example, the MITRE ATT&CK framework is such a helpful tool to cybersecurity practitioners, because it takes everyday terms or lingo that are used specific to the cybersecurity space, and it puts definitions on that syntax, right? So when we say lateral movement, when we say remote desktop or RDP traffic exploited, things like that, we can align on what those same terms are, right? So I think what you added was accurate as far as how firewalls function, where they are in the workplace, and I know we're going to unpack that further about what are some practical uses, why some firewalls may be different, not everything's made the same, and so on and so forth. But no, I think you're spot on.
Yeah, we'll definitely break down more about different types of firewalls as well. So, I think another important fact to consider is firewalls today are way more advanced than they were 5 years ago. They're not just blocking ports anymore, they're inspecting traffic, analyzing behavior, and integrating with other security tools. Now, speaking of change, I think it's important to talk about how firewalls have changed. So, can you break down what the difference is between traditional firewalls and next generation firewalls? We
Most
got them at
definitely.
the perfect time.
Yeah, most definitely. So I think what's going to be the common differentiator is to what level can they filter, to what level can they inspect, and not just inspect, but take action, right? Because it's just one aspect of security to monitor for data and detect data that may point towards malicious activity. But what we're kind of seeing as a trend, and it's a needed trend, is a lot of people are not satisfied with observe report type security in the modern day, right? And because number one, it is leaving something to be done to solve that problem. It is one thing to know about that problem, but there is still work remaining. Kinetically speaking, we have to do something with this new intelligence that we have as far as monitoring a firewall or monitoring anything from a security matter, right? Think of it like you purchase a home security system and you're deploying cameras. It is one thing to be able to go and observe and document and record, but these are reactive security controls, meaning there's nothing that's going to be stopping the behavior or stopping whatever may be maliciously happening to your property, in your property, on your property, inside your home, etc. But the sad part is a lot of security controls today are just as aged and just as archaic in nature as a lot of home security systems. Can we make it? Can we add fancy LCDs? Can we add nice, cool branding? Can we put a sign on the sidewalk? Yeah, these things are nice and flashy, but what do they provide as true value? Are they a deterrent? Yeah, somewhat. One can argue that. But the reality is when you come to firewalls, there's some environments still running off of firewalls that are maybe 10, 20, even 30 or more years old. And the reality is that number one, like anything, software has vulnerabilities. It's made by humans, it's imperfect, and it's going to have vulnerabilities. And so making sure that the firewall age, almost making sure it's in support, is an important piece of this, right? Because even existing firewalls that have been around for 20 years get some software updates that increase the security capabilities of it. And so very much like your phone that has software over the air updates that are provided, it's important to think about your firewall in the same way that there's security vulnerabilities that are being patched. There are bugs being found, backdoors that are being exploited. You want to keep those up to date. That's if, right, regardless of the firewall you have, that's good practice. But what's the main difference? So a next-gen firewall historically is looking at, deep packet inspection. It's looking at anti-malware as far as capabilities, almost pushing that, castle mode analogy out even further, sandboxing files as they come across the firewall, looking at them almost functioning like an antivirus in a way, not to the same degree that's deployed to a machine, but on the network, it's looking at files coming across. More recently, and even more relevantly, specifically to the firewalls that we wield, we have seen URL-based detection for phishing or spam or blacklisted websites, right? Websites with malicious IPs or rogue DNS requests. And so it does a lot more in the way of capabilities, and it's often much more actionable, to my point earlier. And so in the historical firewall, you had to specify from any to any, allow, deny, all these ACLs, back in the Cisco, firewall days that I worked with them. It was very DOS driven, very command line driven type CLI. And there was no GUI, there was no web interface. And with that, you can only do so much as far as presenting syntax and logic. And some people still ride the CLI, and I respect you immensely. But with the greater capabilities that we have today and the complex security controls, we've seen a lot of firewalls move from you got this hacker man like terminal up versus you got this web interface that's very complex, tons of tabs and tons of things to unlock. But really, it's going to come down to, number one, what are the capabilities of the firewall? What capacity does it have to inspect various things? And number two, to what degree could it action or prevent those things before they are happening? Because again, if your firewall can detect certain things, that's fantastic. But you have to account for the delta of effort required. If your automated firewall is not doing it, somebody on your IT desk or your help team or your engineering base has to account for those events, has to look into those connections, has to validate if they're legitimate or not. And so while the more complex next-gen firewall might take more effort to set up and configure, you are getting dividends paid back to you in time in the long run, as well as monetary cost, right? Because they could cost more. You're getting dividends paid back to you in time, number one, in less manual labor of having to action these events or action these types of things, as well as increased capability. Right. It's the version of a home security system that may also alert authorities if it's seeing activity in your side lawn between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m., right? That's an example of maybe a security policy that would be applied to a next-gen firewall.
Drops the storm doors and everything, huh?
That's right. That's right. Sirens go off, wee, right? And all of the above. But exactly. So they have greater forms of actionability, as well as, some more complex security controls like we mentioned earlier.
Yeah. I like to think of it like this. A traditional firewall is like a bouncer checking IDs at the door, right? But a next-gen firewall is like a whole security detail doing background checks and scanning for suspicious behavior inside the venue, and then also taking action, not just radioing to you or just keeping people out, but it's completely different to have a bouncer versus an entire security detail. So, well, all right. So firewalls are essential. We have established that, but they're not foolproof. So what happens if a firewall is misconfigured or outdated? This brings us to an important point: firewall management.
Right.
Many businesses have firewalls, but they're either not configured properly or not maintained. At Blockworks, we take a more proactive approach to firewall management. We don't just set it up and then walk away and talk to you anytime it's invoicing for invoicing. Right. We continuously monitor, we update, fine-tune them to ensure they're providing the best possible protection. So Mike, can you break down how else Blockworks helps businesses manage their firewalls to prevent cyber threats and ensure the proper configuration?
Most definitely. So under the scope of our managed firewall platform, we primarily capitalize on and deploy Palo Alto Networks as a platform. So what does that mean? Palo Alto Networks is a manufacturer of both physical hardware firewalls, but more importantly, their software. What they've been able to kind of harmonize is a lot like Apple and iOS in this way. They've done a very elegant job of blending the hardware with the software capabilities to give us an incredible amount of control, specific to prevention-centric cybersecurity frameworks, right? What we're trying to do, again, is prevent this activity before it becomes a catastrophic in a network. Yeah. And so essentially what we do is we go through a scoping process. We look at the needs of the individual environment, which may be included but not limited to the number of users, the ISP bandwidth, up-down needs as far as what does traffic look like, what does speed requirements look like, is there a need for let's say a physical redundant firewall, or what's known as HA, high availability. And is that a cold HA, hot HA, warm HA, et cetera? There's a whole bunch of different things there. But we go through the scoping process, no different than as if you're tailoring a suit. There are measurements that are going to be specific to this environment. And we have to account for, number one, not just for what the environment needs today, but what it's going to grow into and what it needs in the future. And I think that's one piece where a lot of maybe providers or engineers may not be short-sighted, but just think of, hey, our business isn't growing. Well, what if it does, right? You exhaust all this effort getting a firewall that can't scale or can't grow. You always want a little bit of room, right? And so if anybody has little kids listening to this, you never buy the shoe size that your kid is. You never buy just their shoe size. You always go half a size up, full size up. If you're extra motivated, you go a size and a half up. But why is that? Because you're accounting for growth to take place, and you're going to get a better return on investment for that shoe. And we think of it very similarly when we scope firewalls. And so, but ultimately we take that, we configure that. But the neat thing about this model that's unique to us is we are functioning as a NOC as well as a SOC. And so a network operations center, if our partners need network changes on their Palo that we manage, we are there. We're able to support and facilitate those changes, as well as on the security side. And the neat thing about this is it's two different functions. And as we mentioned earlier, it is one thing to manage a firewall as a network engineer. Not every network engineer can simultaneously think, work, and be certified on certain security protocols, right? It may sound counterintuitive, but these are quickly becoming divergent paths of support versus security, right? And so that left brain, right brain is very difficult to cohabitate in the same cranium, right? And so it's neat because we're able to provide both functions and certify our engineers on Palo's platform, which really capitalizes and prioritizes security. Is accessibility important? Do users need to be able to work and function? Most certainly, right? We're not diminishing that. I'm not valuing that. But there is a measurable amount of risk, as you mentioned, of misconfigured firewalls, which prioritize user accessibility at the cost of security. And we've seen it a lot. A lot, between remote access being open to the internet through RDP and the failure to implement like secure remote access VPN. There's a lot of vulnerabilities that can come into play. And so is a firewall important? Yes. Is it an appliance that you can purchase and plug in and never think about again? I wish. Yeah.
It'd make it a lot easier.
Oh, most definitely. Yeah, most definitely.
So firewalls are a good, strong first layer, but they're not the only defense. So let's break down how they work alongside other security measures to prevent breaches. Just a heads up for any of our audio-only listeners, we'll be breaking down the life cycle of the Follina attack and explaining how the Blockworks tools work together throughout each stage. If you're listening and you would like to see this in action, we do have a video on the Blockworks YouTube channel demonstrating the attack live and showcasing what would happen if you aren't protected. We'll be sure to include that link in the video description. Mike, would you like to do the honors?
Yeah, most definitely. So what we have in front of us is a linear timeline that has a lot of things going on, and we're going to walk through this. But functionally, what we're looking at is a 2022 vulnerability that was a 0-day, that was obviously cataloged by our team, investigated by our team. But what we did was we examined through what gates would this attack navigate as it pertains to where certain security controls may prevent or thwart it, right? So functionally, think of it as if we're looking at a robbery or a murder scene or something after the fact, investigators have to trace those steps. What happened leading up to that event that contributed to the crime being committed or the malicious act being done. And so, we start here on the left and specifically looking at the firewall. And if there is a link, as in a link or a URL referenced here, delivered by either email or other collaboration apps. This is, if you're familiar with phishing, if you're familiar with spam, this is something typically delivered via email. It is crafted in such a way, most often leveraging social engineering, that would prompt the user to download something that they're not aware is malicious. This could be hey, check into your flight, click here to check in. This could be hey, download your return shipping label, right? Like a lot of people are buying things online. A lot of people return those things. And so various different prompts here will prompt the user to download something or click something that is not legitimate. And this is often where this attack starts. This type of attack starts. Not even unique to Follina, but a lot of attacks start here. And so the neat thing here is specific to our firewall, which is referenced here, at the beginning of this life cycle is we do have threat intelligence looking at URLs, like I mentioned earlier, specific to Palo with URL protection. And so the neat thing about this is it's looking at the URL, it's looking at what the URL's behavior is exhibiting, and again, preventing it if it is in fact found to be malicious. Again, your shipping labels should come from really one of three places, either USPS, UPS, or FedEx. If it's not one of those legitimate domains, if it's USP.S, right? It's something that's masquerading or attempting to impersonate a legitimate vendor. That's where it stopped at this stage. But let's, again, because the devil's advocate is found in this entire document, let's say that fails, right? Let's say that the firewall isn't able to stop that, and we don't have a firewall. And so we move up just slightly to the second stage where, again, if that email is being delivered to that user and that user's, clicking on it, that email was delivered to them and not prevented, that's another way where, hey, let's say it got through the firewall, the user can still access this link on the network wise, right? Regardless of how they received it. But let's say that this link was sent to them via email, and that's where it is prevented as well, with our scope of our email security controls that prevent phishing, prevent malware being delivered via email, but also SaaS applications, which is referenced here. Collaboration apps are highly utilized by bad guys simply because they're easy and they're maybe already pre-installed on most people's machines. And these collaboration apps, similar to SharePoint, OneDrive, etc. Teams, even, because Teams now has file transfer and staging. And so, needless to say, a lot of things that can go wrong. And so that's why we monitor both email and cloud SaaS equally under the scope of our purview. But again, devil's advocates here through and through, devil's in the details. Let's say that fails, right? So the firewall doesn't catch it, the email doesn't catch it, and then there is something downloaded to that machine, meaning it got through the firewall, got through the email, they clicked that link, now something is downloaded that is nasty. It is a nasty little bomb sitting on that machine, and as soon as the user clicks on it, it's going to go off, right? So this is where we leverage in the form of our endpoint security, what is known as zero-day endpoint prevention. And so, regardless of if that file has ever been seen before, or if it's a known signature or a known hash, our ultimate goal is, if it's malicious, we want to stop it, even if it's a never documented species of animal, right? No one's ever seen it before. And so in this specific use case with Felina, there was an RTF file that was downloaded. And if you see mention of C2 is simply command and control. It means that somebody has access to your system that shouldn't. That's the long and short of that. And we can unpack that further. But either the RTF file or a doc file that then comes after. A doc file is, think of it as a Word file or a Word Office document. And so, again, we've gone through the firewall, we've gone through the email. Where else can this be prevented? Local to the endpoint, the host, the workstation, the laptop, the server, before it is downloaded, right? This is where we use Next-Gen Antivirus bundled with our EDR that we also manage. And what you're seeing here, if you've ever heard the term, is defense in depth. Defense in depth is simply that I don't rely on a single security control or a single security vendor for that matter. You'd be surprised how many people deploy defense in depth, but then use 4 tools from the same manufacturer. Vendor diversity is an important factor, in my opinion, about defense in depth. If one vendor or one platform has a bad day, it's difficult if all your eggs are in that basket, metaphorically speaking. And so with the endpoint security, we see that, again, being able to prevent that, but in typical devil's advocate fashion, what if that fails, right? Our firewall doesn't catch the link. Our email doesn't prevent the email scanning, doesn't prevent the email from being delivered. And that payload is detonated on the machine. The user runs it thinking that boardingpass.exe is going to get them on their plane. And I promise you it's not, right? There's no exe that will ever get you on a plane. PDF maybe, PNG maybe, but never an exe. And so fourth and finally, what we see here is, again, once that file or once that payload is detonated, it is building, like we talked about with C2, command and control. So think of it as a remote control, right? Maybe you have a baby monitor and you're familiar with, hey, I can remotely access what's going on in my nursery or my child's room. They are functionally using a C2 beacon as a monitor. They are now in the environment. They're able to see what's going on, and then the threat actor can then, they have a bug in the system, they have a virus or some foothold, and they can laterally move from that. And so, but the point here is that even if We come on the scene, we'll say, with a managed Palo, and all three of these things have failed prior to us even finding out or arriving on the scene. And this has happened. Full disclosure, this has happened. We have been brought into environments right of boom, and after something kinetically has gone wrong, either logically, either physically, or both. And so we have brought in often at this life cycle, and we drop a firewall in that we're managing, and we throw it in simply a monitoring only mode. So we are now looking for indicators of activity that say, hey, this is now a private investigator at this point. We have the suspicion of maybe something going on, or we have the suspicion of something malicious happening, but we're just going to remain incognito. We're going to monitor. We're not going to thwart anything. We're going to see what exactly is happening. And the beauty of our firewall has the ability to not just detect command and control, but even prevent and kill that session, right? Prevent that network connection from ever taking place, choking off that C2, choking off that remote access that a threat actor has. And so again, navigating through this is just one example of a vulnerability, codenamed Felina, but this really shows you that, hey, there are many different controls and functions when it comes to cybersecurity. You can have network security, for the primary topic of today, in the form of a firewall, but email security and endpoint security live at different places in that castle analogy, right? You can stop an attack at different life cycles, at different phases, and even after, right? Let's say, hey, I'm in a compromised situation. I still need help. All hope is not lost. All hope is not lost. You can absolutely still regain control of the situation, but you have to have, number one, the right tools, and number two, the right personnel managing it. Because again, tools by themselves won't solve you. People by themselves won't solve you. You need a really harmonious relationship between those two, wielding that. As we often say, the samurai and the sword. That's the real killer. And so, but yeah, so again, hopefully this infographic made sense. And because it's, we always post the recording after we are here live. Feel free to go back, slow it down, speed it up if needed. But again, really, that is going to be the example given of how a firewall would bookend, specifically the firewalls we manage, would bookend being able to stop this specific attack life cycle if this vulnerability is exploited.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that each tool plays a key role. Creating a layer defense that keeps threats from slipping through, as Mike broke down. If something gets past one layer, another layer is there to stop it. And thank you so much, Mike, for that amazing breakdown, by the way. Well, before we wrap up, let's go over some best practices that businesses should be doing to ensure their firewalls remain an effective security measure. I think this one is a great takeaway for our audience, and in my opinion, a few key best practices would be keeping your firewalls updated, using access control wisely, monitoring firewall logs, and last but not least, pairing firewalls with other security measures. As we mentioned, firewalls alone aren't enough. They should be a part of a layered defense strategy. Mike, how about you? Anything further to add there?
Yeah, a little something took place a couple years ago where we all left the office for a little bit, and some have yet to go back, and that's okay. I respect you and your company if that's the decision that's been made. But we made a lot of network changes. And I say we as in IT practitioners, security practitioners, in order to keep business up and running. My biggest real practical takeaway here was please audit your open access ports on your firewall that are public facing, right? And again, we talked a lot about north-south traffic today. We didn't talk much about east-west traffic, securing the network laterally, meaning from one department or one location or one type of devices. Network segmentation, we could hit a whole TED talk, probably 4 hours long on the safety brief if we could, but most of our viewers don't have that kind of endurance, nor do we. And so, but really what I would say is, number one, monitor and audit because of the accommodations we had to make to keep business running and keep livelihoods intact. There were a lot of changes made, and you would be shocked to sit in our seat and see how many of those rules are just still out there and not used, not needed, not required. But threat actors are having a heyday with them. They're having a heyday with them because we affect functionally, right? Think of it if you go out of town, you're putting the key under the mat, you're putting a backup key in the back door. If you're back in town, those keys don't need to stay there perpetually, right? And so we've made a lot of accommodations for us being quote unquote out of town on the network, and we've really never double backed. And again, so I would say that is a huge initiative. Go and do that. Obviously get rid of OpenRDP on the firewall. That's archaically old lesson written on stone tablets. I think that we have stone tablets with that guidance passed on to us from our ancestors. But regardless, it's still out there. You'll still find RDP open some places. But I would also say, to your point, Elizabeth, also looking at, hey, if you know or have suspicion of, I don't know if I have the energy or the time to invest into really hardening a network. We work in a variety of different capacities, but I will say that, short interactions or kind of pro serve interactions are not uncommon for us either. Coming in and hardening firewalls that we are certified on and support. It doesn't mean it always has to result in managed services. We certainly do that for a lot of our partners, but we provide value in a lot of different ways as it pertains to network security and network hardening. And so, again, hope that this was valuable. But 2 practical takeaways that I'm given are: number 1, audit all of your remote access rules, specifically your public facing, outside facing rule sets, as well as secure remote access VPN really being locked down by MFA, because username and passwords are, again, they are trivial, they are somewhat easy to crack, and if a user is updating their password, they're most often appending a number, if that, to the end of their password when they change it. And so, if I have a password breach from 2024 and it was Mike 5, guess what? Guess next year it's Mike 6. And so, we need to be very mindful of MFA and the value it brings. And so, yeah, those would be my 2 bigs.
Solid points today, Mike. Thank you so much for sharing and joining us today. Well, that's all the time we have for today, but let's remember, if you're relying on a set it and forget it approach, you're asking for trouble. Firewalls may have been around for decades, but they are still a must-have in 2025. They're smarter, more advanced, and still one of the best ways to keep cyber threats at bay. Well, thank you so much for tuning in to the Safety Brief. Stay secure, stay informed, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks all.